The United States economy creates and destroys about 5 million jobs every month. And it's only that when you see, we gained 200,000 jobs, well, that's because we actually destroyed 5 million, then we created 5.2 million, and there's your job gain for the month. So the U.S. economy is constantly engaging in that type of dislocation.
Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Mona Charan, policy editor at the Bulwark and a syndicated columnist, and I am joined by our regulars, Damon Linker, who writes the Substack newsletter Notes from the Middle Ground, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, and Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center. Our special guest this week is Scott Lincicome of the Cato Institute, who also writes for the Dispatch about trade, economics, all of those good things. So, Scott, thanks so much for joining us. This is not your first time here. We haven't seen you in a while, and welcome to your first video version of this podcast.
Yeah, I would have worn a nicer shirt had I known. But
I'm sorry, I forgot to say.
No problem at all.
You look great, though.
It's in my puffy vest. It's fine. Thanks again for having me back.
Oh, great to see you. So one of the things, and for our listeners, we, of course, are going to get to what's going on the Hill and all of that. All of that is coming up. But first, I'm really glad to have Scott here because one of the things that is close to my heart, Scott, is a project that you have inaugurated, which is a defense of globalization and all of the ways in which it has made our lives better, and not just Americans' lives, but the world.
Sure.
It's enriched all of us. But let's get down to a really nitty-gritty aspect of it that you write about, food.
Yeah.
And particularly, like, what is available in supermarkets. I mean, Linda and Bill and I are old enough to remember, like, when we were young, when we were kids, there weren't that many things in supermarkets. You didn't have mangoes and kiwis and papayas and all of these exotic things that are now absolutely taken for granted. You couldn't get blueberries in the wintertime. You couldn't get strawberries all year round. All of that kind of thing we just take for granted. And that, you say, is because of globalization. These things come from other countries.
Yeah, for sure. And, you're not that old, or at least maybe I'm as old as you are, because it was also my childhood. I can remember quite well that, mom would be really excited that they had certain produce at the farmer's market in downtown Dallas, or at the grocery store. She'd be freaking out about the availability of avocados and other things. It is, I think for those of us that if you're Gen X or above, you remember all that stuff. But if you're one of the youths, this is we take it totally for granted that you're going to be able to walk into any grocery store and not just have the availability of produce. I mean, that's one of the things we write about. It's the explosion of international foods and of cuisines, and all of this stuff is thanks to globalization properly understood.
Right. So you say in your piece that in 1975, the average supermarket had about 8,900 items, and by 2022, it was up to more than 31,000 items available. And speaking of the kids, so the emblematic fruit of the Generation Z is the avocado, right? Avocado toast, et cetera. And something like 88 or 90% of those are coming to us from Mexico.
Yeah, right? And it's really a testament to two aspects of globalization. One is technology. A lot of modern globalization is nothing to do with politicians or trade agreements or anything. It is just about the proliferation of things like containerized shipping and refrigerated shipping, and then information technology that allows for kind of real-time tracking of this. And that allows specialization to do its thing. And a lot of specialization in the produce context is different climates, not only being conducive in general to producing things like bananas or pineapples. I've written a little bit about that. Pineapples used to be this grand luxury good that Louis XIV would expend massive amounts of money to maybe get one per season, and now you can get them at your grocery store for like 99 cents. But the other big part of that is just simply the hemispheres. The fact is that, half the world is in summer when we're in winter up here. And that combined with all that other technology allows us to enjoy it. The second big aspect, though, does have to do with politicians, and that is the really tremendous liberalization of global trade barriers since the 1940s, starting with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which we call today the World Trade Organization, but of course including a lot of U.S. trade agreements as well, NAFTA, now the USMCA, the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement, and others. And because that liberalized tariff and non-tariff barriers and created some harmonization of regulations that allows us to more easily and more cheaply import what technology is, again, allowing us to do. It lowers the taxes. It makes it easier for compliance and the rest.
Yeah, so the critics would say, oh, fine. So you have your Kiwis, and that's great, and you have your cheap labor, but the fact is that globalization has hurt us because it has sent all of our good jobs overseas, and so we are really the losers in this competition in the world.
Yeah, and that's of course a very common, I think, misconception about globalization. We have, as part of our Defending Globalization project, we have essays on all sorts of stuff. So my food essay doesn't really get into that aspect. But right. Look, we have an essay on kind of the misguided nostalgia of a pre-globalization era, whether it's the 1970s or the 1950s, or some cases people lionize the 1910s, but the reality is that across all sorts of metrics, things are better for the most part than they were in those eras, whether it is median worker wages or living standards or the rest. And certainly there are exceptions, and that's currently true. But the broad arc of progress is still quite evident in those. And then I think the other big point, though, is that we too often blame globalization, capital G, for a lot of stuff that has really very little to do with globalization. A large chunk of those manufacturing jobs were not lost to China or Mexico. They were lost to South Carolina or the rest of the Sun Belt. And then another big chunk of those manufacturing jobs were simply lost to productivity. We now can make 10 times as much steel today as we could with the same amount of labor back in, say, 1980. And then finally, just simply changing consumer tastes. As countries get richer, we tend to consume more services and fewer goods, and that's going to have effects on manufacturing as well. But globalization is an easy scapegoat. Foreigners are an easy scapegoat, and that allows us to cast so much blame for real world problems on something that has very little to do with that, without, I would noting any of those wonderful benefits that it provides beyond simply having, avocados anytime you want.
Right. So there's been a study, I'm sure you saw this, about Trump's tariffs and whether they succeeded in bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and whether they were a net positive for the country. And the results were slightly equivocal because there were some places where they sort of hedged, said, it's sort of a wash. But basically, the notion that Trump had, and by the way, Biden has not removed most of the tariffs. He has on some European countries, but mostly he's kept the tariffs in place. And the result is what? Again, the average person, I think, is very easily lulled into believing that it's better to have made in America, it's better to be self-sufficient, and why would we want to be sending our money overseas? And therefore, we should slap tariffs on foreigners. Yeah. and that's good for American business. So,
Yeah.
what do you say to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this gets to the third big point about globalization that a lot of people miss, and that is that globalization does mean disruption. That disruption means a lot of good stuff, whether it's via comparative advantage and kind of moving up the economic food chain, or whether it means having access to all those wonderful fruits and vegetables, or simply having access to cheap televisions and the rest, those benefits. But certainly, globalization has some disruptive things that people don't like, and including job losses. That's certainly true. But the third big mistake, I think, that's made frequently in the discourse is that protectionism, mainly tariffs, but other types of protectionism as well, buy American rules and automotive quotas and the rest, can somehow magically bring those jobs and that economic activity back. And the literature is just quite clear, and this latest study just simply reinforces it, that protectionism really is a terrible way to try to boost these industries that we've lost over the years. And it's terrible because first, it of course raises costs. If the way a tariff is a tax, the tax is going to raise the price of imports, but it's also going to make people buy more expensive domestic products. That's the whole point. But it just isn't. So it's costly, but it's just not very good and effective at actually boosting output and employment in the protected sectors. And because of that,
and also it leads to retaliation,
yes,
right? Which then harms our exports.
For sure. And then there's all sorts of corruption and cronyism that's attached to it. Some of the earliest forms of lobbying in the United States was related to tariff policy, which used to be set by Congress. And then we saw during the Trump years this exclusion process for Trump steel and aluminum tariffs, which, like you said, remain in place, saw a boom in lobbying for those exclusions. And according to multiple independent government reports, has been riddled with at least the perception or the appearance of cronyism and corruption throughout. So that's, if you look at those studies, if you look at that data, it's another strike against this kind of anti-globalization push that's pretty trendy in DC, is that regardless if you don't like the disruption that globalization provides, protectionism or deglobalization is a not just costly, but really ineffective means of producing the outcomes you want. And that paper, which was written by some of the authors of the China shock literature, which protectionists love, they use it all the time to justify new protectionism, said, sorry, you not only aren't bringing these jobs back, but you have this retaliation and you're seeing net economic costs overall.
Yep. Okay. Anybody else want in on this? Because I have other things I would love to ask Scott, but if somebody else wants a whack, please let me know. Bill, go.
Scott, this is a more generic question.
Sure.
And this will give me a chance to continue my adult education. I am staring at a chart produced by the St. Louis Fed, a chart that I've studied many times before, on inflation-adjusted hourly male wages.
Yeah.
And the sort of the flat-footed, naive reading of this chart is that hourly male wages corrected for inflation have not risen since 1979.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we've struggled in recent years to get back to where they were in 1979 after a very substantial period in which they were substantially lower. So, is globalization making any contribution to this trend, or do you deny the trend on technical grounds?
Well, I do think there are technical reasons to question the data you're looking at. The big one is the inflation adjustment that's used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to typically show real wage gains. Michael Strain over at the American Enterprise Institute has done really amazing work, and a lot of other people too. It's not just Mike, showing that the inflation adjustment that's used to show real wage gains dramatically overstates inflation. So if you overstate inflation, and it makes your real wage gain look much smaller than it actually is. So if you recalculate those exact same nominal wage figures using a better inflation adjustment, the one the Fed prefers, the PCE index, you actually will see more gains than what you see in the standard BLS data. So there is a technical component. And that's really important. And when if you look at Mike's numbers other numbers from the joint economic community and stuff, you see that there have been pretty substantial median and other percentile wage gains. So for the median worker, for workers at the bottom end of the spectrum, so at the 10th percentile, pretty substantial wage gains since the 1990s, since kind of our era of peak globalization. In fact, the stagnation and decline was really occurring there. So the first point. Second point is that there's a temporal problem in blaming globalization entirely. I think it's certainly fair to say that certain low-wage manufacturing jobs and things like textiles and furniture and the rest, and these were jobs that did at that time in the 1970s predominantly employ men with less education. I think it's certainly true, and I don't think anybody would deny it, that globalization plays a part in those jobs moving offshore. They actually they moved from the Northeast down to the Rust Belt and then down to the Carolinas, and then they finally kicked offshore. This kind of natural progress. The issue, though, is that the big declines you see in the wage data actually really occur before peak globalization, right? Peak globalization is really the mid-1990s and beyond. And as long as you take out, your recessions, Great Recession was terrible for a lot of reasons, but that wasn't really a globalization thing, right? You actually see a pretty decent upward trend in those figures since the mid-1990s. It was really kind of the 1980s where you had this decline or stagnation in those trends. But I think the last point that's really important is there are all of these non-globalization factors that also play a big role, particularly if you take the data back farther than the 1970s. A big one is the entry of women into the labor force, which is a dramatic expansion to labor supply. The general transformation of the U.S. economy going again along that arc that all developed economies go through, whether they have giant trade surpluses and active industrial policies and lots of protectionism, where you go from having more manufacturing and then manufacturing goes down, you start to have more services. So that is going to preference a different type of worker. So these kind of seismic changes that occur in the economy also play a huge role in what is a real trend for, say, less educated males and the type of work that may have been quite prevalent in the 1970s. So long story short is, I think globalization can play a role, but it's really, really complicated. And blaming it all on globalization is, which is so often the case, is particularly in politics, is pretty wrong-headed. One last thing I just note, and then the last final point is that we had tons of protectionism back then too. In fact, more protectionism, and we still were hemorrhaging these jobs. I mean, you look at textiles, for example. We had textile quotas, which are very restrictive, through the mid-1990s, and yet you saw substantial offshoring of textile employment and manufacturing throughout that whole period, including in the Carolinas. Again, really complicated story in which globalization plays a role, but a smaller one.
Here's a time series that does make sense to me. Okay, let's take a look at manufacturing jobs in the United States. We had as many manufacturing jobs in the year 2000 as we did in the year 1990. Trust me.
I got it.
Okay?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Then between 2001 and 2007, before the Great Recession started, we lost 3.3 million manufacturing jobs.
Correct.
In the 7 years after China's accession to the WTO.
Yeah.
Is it entirely naive? Is it, what the rhetoricians call the post hoc ergo propter hoc argument, after this and therefore because of this, that, in the 7 years after China's accession to the WTO, we lost more than 20% of our manufacturing jobs?
Yeah. So the long story short is certainly Chinese imports played some role in that decline. But and I will let me first plug part of our Defending Globalization project. I wrote an essay on the China shock literature and all of the economic evidence here, and it's really accessible. It's short, unlike my long-windedness. It's only about 4,000 words, so it's pretty easy to get through pretty quickly. But I'll give you the very Cliff Notes version of that already. Cliff Notes version is that even the most critical economic analyses of the China shock period, that period from about 1999 to about 2010. But you can narrow it if you want to get rid of the Great Recession. Even those show a top maximum manufacturing jobs hit caused by Chinese imports of 1 million of that 3.5 million, give or take. So 1 million jobs. It's actually over a longer period, so it's even going to be fewer than that. So that means that it's only 1/3 of the decline if you accept those numbers as gospel, as being China shock related. The caveats, though, are that other economists, equally reputable, also published in very fancy journals, have found much smaller declines, ones that exist. Again, no one is denying import competition exists. They're simply saying maybe it was 500,000 of the 3.5 million, or 200 even fewer. And then the other point is that other economists have said, well, what else happened in the U.S. economy at the same time? And what else did that Chinese import competition produce? And what they found is that many of the same manufacturing firms that were getting rid of manufacturing jobs, factory jobs, were actually adding services. Other manufacturing plants, services jobs, other manufacturing plants were adding jobs related to exports because they were exporting more to China. We had more jobs in agriculture and all these things. And they said that when you add all those other economic effects, because China's import competition meant lower prices, more access to industrial inputs and other things, and then a new export market. It's about a wash on kind of the total jobs hit. We actually maybe gained a few jobs if you look at the economy-wide modeling that these economists like to do, and that we ended up net economic benefits overall. So it is a complicated issue, and it's undeniably true that if you look at those micro cases and if you look at those direct effects, Chinese import competition caused manufacturing job losses in the United States. But once you get past that correct assertion, it's a huge leap to say, aha, 3.5 million jobs lost in manufacturing. Aha, that's all China. Ergo, everything was terrible because of China's entry into the global trading system.
Let me just, before I let you go, it's so interesting. I just want to underline one aspect of this because I was also going to ask you about that. Namely, when you're evaluating the effect of trade, don't you have to look at, in addition to jobs lost in perhaps manufacturing plants, the cheaper inputs that you're able to bring in from China or other countries that then create value here so that we can then export more and create. So you're also creating jobs. And it's really hard to tease out all these different threads, right?
Exactly. And it's not so about half of everything we import, including from China, is industrial inputs. So stuff our manufacturers use to make other stuff. So certainly those imports are actually going to be supporting manufacturing output and jobs in the United States. But then there are all the other jobs connected to trade that we never think about. Transportation and logistics, the guys that work down at the ports or drive the trucks and all of that. manufacturing is increasingly tied to services. So, the Internet of Things, you have software, you have design and marketing and all of these other jobs that are bundled up. And when you include all of those that additional economic activity that's tied to those imports, those job-destroying imports, you see a much different economic picture than if you just isolate on the import competition and the direct jobs effect. Now, I'll add two caveats there, though. First, it is very easy for a guy like me to sit in my puffy vest in Raleigh, North Carolina on this Zoom call and just hand wave away those direct effects, right? It is undeniably true, right? That's going to be hard for certain workers in certain places and certain companies. So we shouldn't simply say, nothing to be done, or the rest, right? And I wrote a whole book last year about all of these types of policies that we could implement that are free market policies that would help workers adjust and live better lives and the rest. None of them involving protectionism, as you could imagine. But the other big caveat is that I think too often I think the China shock literature has done this too, is we don't think about these job losses in the national context. Even again, if you accept those China shock numbers as gospel, the biggest numbers, even if you include the services jobs that are connected to those, so that raises your job cost to about 2 million jobs. When you look at it over the period you're talking about, which is like more than a decade in the China shock literature, you're talking about a tiny fraction of total job losses during that same period, because the United States economy creates and destroys about 5 million jobs every month. And it's only that when you see, we gained 200,000 jobs, well, that's because we actually destroyed 5 million, then we created 5.2 million, and there's your job gain for the month. So the U.S. economy is constantly engaging in that type of dislocation, voluntarily and involuntarily. And we have to think about that type of churn in this broader context as well, because it is part of living in a dynamic and wonderful American economy, whether it's related to globalization or interstate trade or technology or anything else. And it's critical that, we have that context when we talk about just trade stuff, because it's a much, much bigger, broader story.
Well, thank you, Scott, so much. You're so clear. It's always great to talk with you. And I recommend that everybody look at what's the website for the Globalization Project?
It's cato.org /defending -globalization. But if you Google Cato defending globalization, it'll come right up.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, it was one of those weeks when there was way too much news. So we're recording on Thursday. We've just had an oral argument at the Supreme Court regarding the 14th Amendment disqualification matter for Trump. And people who listened to the oral argument, I listened to a little snippet, came away with the impression that the decision is looking like it might be 9-0 against disqualifying him. So that will provide some clarity. Of course, Trump will probably declare that this is total and complete vindication and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that happened. But of course, we now also have another specter. Linda, I'm going to start with you by reading to you a quote, because what's at stake here, really, you cannot overstate the importance of what the Republicans are now toying with, which is abandoning Ukraine and really abandoning America's world role. This is from the new Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk. Dear Republican senators of America, Ronald Reagan, who helped millions of us to win back our freedom and independence, must be turning in his grave today. Shame on you. So, first of all, what do you make of the Republican position, which was, we'd really love to help Ukraine. Don't get us wrong. It's just that we have to deal with the urgent emergency on our own southern border, first, and then, well, you tell us. I mean, the Democrats basically gave them almost everything that they asked for. And they turned on a dime and said no.
This was the most conservative and comprehensive change in immigration policy that we have seen in a generation that was proffered. And the Republicans who continue to claim there is this enormous crisis, that we're being invaded, that our security is at risk, nonetheless were willing to stop the bill from going forward. And there were major changes. It totally rewrote the amnesty law, making it much harder to claim amnesty, creating a new system whereby amnesty claims could be adjudicated quickly at the border, not letting people into the country to stay for years before they came before a judge to adjudicate those claims. There were all sorts of provisions in the bill that Republicans had been clamoring for. So I think this was so dishonest. We've talked about it a number of times on the podcast. I wrote a column for the Bulwark in which I said that there were lies that were being promulgated by the Republicans and that they basically boxed themselves in to a position where there was no way, after they claimed the bill was amnesty, after they claimed that this was going to let in 5,000 illegal immigrants in every single day, that once they did that, they couldn't vote for it. So this is a disgrace. And more importantly, you're absolutely right on the Ukraine issue. This is a matter not just of the security of Ukraine. This is a matter of the United States standing in the world, whether people can take our word when we say that we are going to take a position, that we are going to help an ally. If we are willing to walk away on this kind of a whim, it's a disaster. Now, as we're on recording this podcast, the aid to Ukraine bill has moved forward to at least be considered by the Senate. The Republicans did not block consideration, but who knows what's going to happen over the next few days. And I just think the Republicans can't be trusted.
Damon, in addition to, it's always my colleague, Charlie Sykes, who alas is leaving the Bulwark, but Charlie likes to say that if you want to know the direction of the Republican Party, do not look at the actions of people like Mitch McConnell, or other sort of old leaders from the past. Look at where the entertainment wing of the party is, and look at what's going on, at OAN and so forth. And sure enough, who did we see pop up in Moscow this week but Tucker Carlson, who amazingly has been able to secure an interview with Vladimir Putin, which he says none of the Western press was interested in. You care to comment?
Well, yeah, Tucker, wow, really got the scoop there, landed the big fish.
Yeah. I should just clarify that Christiane Amanpour and many others came out saying, do you not think we've been asking repeatedly for interviews? Even Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's press secretary, came out and said, actually, yeah, we get requests for interviews all the time. We don't grant them. But anyway, go on.
Right, exactly. Tucker has decided that there is much more to be gained for him. I'm sure financially and in terms of notoriety as a right-wing journalist and pundit, if he basically just becomes a propagandist for Vladimir Putin. And that does tell you where a lot of the Republican Party is. I do think it is still divided, but as Bill has clarified with us using public opinion polling data at several points over the last 6 months, it's now something like 70% generally pro Putin and Russia, 30% against,
Whereas before Trump became president, that probably would have been the reverse. And then going back from there, quite a bit more in the anti-Putin direction before that. So I don't even know, frankly, what to say about this. It is such a dramatic and shocking turn of events. But I do think it is the reality that we have to live with here. The reality is that the Republicans narrowly control the House. Things are very narrowly divided, even more narrowly divided in the Senate. We still have Mitch McConnell in a position of authority who very much would like to fund aid to Ukraine, but he is rapidly losing support in his caucus. And between this and the fact that there's been this rebellion on the border bill that he was very much in favor of putting forward, I wouldn't be surprised if he faced a real leadership challenge soon. So this is just not good on any front, and it's very distressing. I mean, I want to go back to Bill again for a moment to remind listeners that it was a couple of weeks ago that he put the words discharge petition on the table with regard to what we then thought would be this kind of magnum bill that would have the border deal and funding for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. It turns out, I guess we're not going to get that bill because it has died in its crib because McConnell decided he needed to get rid of it, and so there won't be a bill to file a discharge petition about. But the Senate is trying now to get out the funding part of that bill. And I believe we could end up in a situation, Bill will clarify because he knows the intricacies of the institutional issues in Congress better than I do, I'm afraid. But it looks like that, trying to get a discharge position to get discharge together for what will be the funding bill, if it can get out of the Senate and be sent to the House, may be our only path forward here, and I have to keep my fingers crossed for it. But, is there cause for any hope on that front? I'll go back to Mona, but I'm asking Bill, too.
Sure.
Help.
Yeah, Bill. So, okay, are you still thinking discharge petition is a possibility? And before you answer, please explain what a discharge petition is.
Sure. A discharge petition is a procedure in the House of Representatives that enables a majority of House members to, affix their signatures to a document expressing their desire to bring a bill to the floor, the objection of the Speaker and the Rules Committee to the contrary notwithstanding. It is, other than trying to append a bill that can't get onto the floor to a bill that can get on the floor, it seems to be the only viable option. But of course, you can't you can't circulate and try to get signatures for a discharge petition until you have a bill that you're trying to discharge from purgatory. Right. And so all of this discussion presupposes that there is something that will get out of the Senate in the first place. We now know what it's not going to be, but we still don't know what it is going to be. We don't know what it is going to be because the negotiation now shifts to the question of the number of amendments that different senators will be allowed to offer to the naked, authorization bill for aid to Taiwan and Ukraine and Israel, and and a number of senators who voted against the compromise, the bipartisan, or should I say tripartisan compromise that was negotiated and over a period of 4 months and died in less than 4 days, a lot of them are going to try to offer immigration-related amendments that are even more severe than what was agreed to during those negotiations. Some of those amendments may pass. But they certainly won't if there's going to be a 60 vote threshold, which there frequently is, to adding amendments to the bill. All of that has to be worked out between the majority leader and the minority leader. To complicate things further, the Senate was about to leave on vacation. They've worked their fingers to the bone, the story goes, in recent weeks, and now they need a 2-week vacation to recover from their arduous labors. If you detect some sarcasm in my voice, you've heard me correctly, and there is no way that they're going to be able to go on that vacation and deal with this bill promptly at the same time. So, this majority leader will now have to decide whether he wants to cancel his senator's vacation in order to deal with this. And final point, in case the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer thought he was going to catch a break, Senator Rand Paul has announced his intention to slow walk the entire bill and consume, quote, every minute of available floor time. If that happens, then this could be a long, tedious process indeed.
And if anyone doubts it, if you've been watching Rand Paul, you know that he's just obnoxious enough to
He'll
do
that. He'll do that, and he doesn't
Yes.
care what the other 99 senators think of him, which is a great source of strength, actually.
Yeah,
so,
I suppose.
So,
a little lonely, though.
Okay, and then if that bill, if there is a bill, there's no guarantee of that, and it comes over to the House, how many Republican House members are going to be willing to break ranks on an issue of this passion and volatility, where the stakes for their careers are going to be extremely high because, Donald Trump will see to that. There are a lot of bumps in this road, is the long and short of it.
Can I answer that
Linda,
question?
I'm coming
Okay,
to you.
great. I'll answer Bill's question. How many are going to break ranks? Fewer than 0. That's probably
0.
yes.
Exactly.
But I did want to clarify something because our listeners and viewers can't see it, but we sometimes chat with each other. And Bill suggested that I may have used the word amnesty rather than asylum when I was talking about the asylum laws and rules that would be changed. If I did that, let me clarify that. It is the asylum laws that will be changed. But I did use amnesty in referring to one of the lies that Republicans are telling. Republicans are claiming this bill is amnesty. This bill has 0 amnesty in it, none whatsoever.
Right.
Right. Okay. So, Linda, I'm going to come back to you now because one of the lessons of this past week, and it's been clear for some time, but it's really been brought into sharp relief now, is that, we can talk about divisions within the Republican Party. And certainly we've seen in Iowa, New Hampshire, there is a rump of of Republican voters who are not Trumpy. But when it comes to Republican office holders and whether they will stand up to the MAGA faction in a fight or whether they will fold every time, right? I mean, and look at what happened to James Lankford. He is, as conservative a senator as you can get from Oklahoma. He's been supportive of Trump. He weighed in and agreed to do the negotiations on this compromise bill, which actually gave most of the wound up being very favorable to Republicans. And at one signal from Trump, he is being destroyed by right-wing media. His career may be over.
He may be challenged next time. He may be primaried. The Republican Party of the state of Oklahoma has already, I think, disavowed him. Censored him.
Censored him. Yes.
I think they'd like to censor him, but you're right, they censored him. It is really striking. And I think it really boils down to one of the biggest drivers in politics, and that is ambition. These are very ambitious people who want to keep their job, and they also may want to run for higher office than the office that they hold. And so long as Donald Trump is pulling the strings in MAGA world, and what he says basically skews everything politically, then you're not going to have people who want to keep their job be willing to speak out.
Okay, with that, I want to spend a little time discussing this very interesting case in Michigan, where the parents of a school shooter who killed 4 of his classmates and wounded 7, including a teacher, have been charged, and the mother has now been convicted of involuntary manslaughter because of her role in failing to basically anticipate that her son might do this and being completely irresponsible as a parent, including she and her husband purchased a gun for their 15-year-old and gave it to him even though they had good reason to believe he was having severe mental health problems, really severe. At one point, he put a picture in his geometry notebook showing a human body that was covered in blood and the words, "My thoughts won't stop, help me, blood everywhere, the world is dead, my life is useless," etc. Jennifer Crumbley was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. She can spend a very long time in prison. Now, when I first heard about this case, I'm going to go to you first, Damon, I thought, well, good. I mean, somebody needs to be held accountable. This was grossly irresponsible. But now I am thinking, it was terrible what she did, and the husband is going to be tried next month. And yet, this case, they say hard cases make bad law. This case is a problem because it was so clear. The parents were so awful. But there are going to be many other cases where it's more, murky. And I can see holding parents, so in Virginia, there was a case where a 6-year-old brought a gun to school, and the mother was tried for, negligent, handling of the gun. That I can see. But to hold the parents responsible for the actual murders, I don't know. It feels, I'm worried about the precedent of this. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm similarly conflicted. I mean, my general kind of way of operating is to think that moral and immoral acts are attributable to the agent involved. So if this kid did what he's accused of doing, he should be punished because he's the one who did it. And of course, there can be accessories to crimes, and those around the agent who committed the crime can be punished. But it makes me nervous, the thought that it's not enough to just punish the perpetrator. You actually have to punish with the potential, felony convictions, jail time, long jail time for parents when they didn't pull the trigger. There's no evidence they encouraged him to pull the trigger. There's a certain, there are levels of distance from the immoral act. And this seems sufficiently far removed that it feels like a stretch to me, even in a case like this, where, as you say, Mona, it's more clear-cut than many cases would be. So it makes me uncomfortable. But it's also the case, I sometimes joke, showing you that I'm not really at all a libertarian, that why don't we have licenses for parents?
Yeah.
It's not that a government bureaucracy would do a great job in that role, but it does make you think that oh my goodness, anybody can have a kid, and there's no telling how irresponsible they're going to be, and is there going to be a parent in our society that's awash in something like 400 million firearms that some of these families are going to make easily available to very disturbed kids, these weapons that are weapons of war and potential murder, and on a large scale. So, then I think, well, shouldn't there be some way to have a deterrent for parents? Look, if your kid goes, as we used to say, postal when these things would happen in post offices or in postal offices, but now they happen in schools and all kinds of other public areas. Then I think, well, yeah, maybe there should be. I don't know if the actual charge here of involuntary manslaughter, that sounds a little much, but maybe there should be a new category of crime, like, severe parental disregard or something. So it's maybe an area of the law where we have a little work to do, because unfortunately America in the year 2024 has such problems to address.
So my husband and I have 3 children. We adopted our first one and had to go through an unbelievable battery of psychological tests and physical tests, and all kinds of things were examined about us. And we didn't mind. We didn't object. We just thought it'd be much better if everybody who wanted to be a parent, even natural parents, had to go through that. But anyway, Bill, so we do live in a world where we have... It seems pretty hopeless that we can get any sort of a handle on our gun violence problem at the level of supply. There's so much resistance to gun control. But many people say, well, okay, so you go to the other side. You make it clear that if parents are irresponsible enough to have an unsecured gun, and by the way, this gun was not in a safe in their house. It was available, accessible. And when the boy, in this case, I think, again, this case was so clear, he was caught at the school library looking up how to get ammunition, and they alerted the parents, and the mother texts her son later and says, LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught. So anyway, Bill. By the way, the parents both had criminal records as well.
Why am I not surprised to learn that from you, Mona?
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm bewitched, bothered, and perplexed by all sorts of cases. Not this one.
Yeah.
Let me explain why. Okay. This was not a case where a troubled kid went out and got a bootleg gun and concealed that fact from his parents, and the rest is history. Okay, these parents went out and bought their minor son a gun. And just to make sure he knew how to use it, the mother then takes him to the firing range for further instruction. They take no steps whatsoever to secure this gun. And then they're surprised when their mentally disturbed son shoots people after they've had multiple indications that his disturbance could, and his hallucinations about demons in the house could assume a violent form. I don't know what the different gradations of killing are in the law. There is, there's something like, as I recall, negligent homicide or contributory negligence. The lawyers on this call will help me out.
It varies by state.
And my view is this. We are now living in a country where the Supreme Court's misinterpretation of the Second Amendment has made legal regulation of firearms virtually impossible. I therefore look with extreme favor on other aspects of the law that can constrain the proliferation of irresponsible minors with deadly firearms. The rest for me is a rounding error. And maybe this conviction will finally persuade negligent parents that they have some skin in the game. I sure hope so, because what we have right now is worse than the Wild West. Where at least there were some people who were gunslingers and some who weren't. Now everybody is a gunslinger. End of sermon.
Linda, what do you think? You're a gun owner, and I presume have always kept them safe and locked up and all of that and taken precautions. But But so where do you come down on all this? Should there be some lesser crime that the parents might be convicted of, like, some kind of negligence, or should they be liable for involuntary manslaughter as this one?
Well, I think they ought to be liable civilly. I think they ought to be able to be sued because they did purchase the weapon for the boy and contributed to his learning how to use it, and then they were negligent in not ensuring that he didn't have access to it without their permission, and that he had access as well to ammunition. I understand Bill's sentiment. I want to see these parents punished because I think they were at fault. I don't think convicting the mother of manslaughter is the right approach. I think there were other avenues that the district attorney's office could have taken. They could have pursued the purchasing a weapon for an underage person, directly. Maybe Bill's right. Maybe, the Supreme Court.
Is that a crime?
Well,
in
I
Michigan
know that's the
purchase?
Question. And
I doubt it because because kids can go hunting with their parents
that's true.
legally in
So
Michigan.
they may not have had that avenue.
Yeah.
I do think that the civil avenue can be important. I think, yes, incarcerating people is one method of punishment. But I guess I come down more with Damon that when you're convicting somebody essentially of murder, and in this case manslaughter, but it is the killing of another individual, I think they have to be more than a contributor of the weapon that was used in that murder. And I think you're opening the door to real problems if you go down that route. So I want to see them punished, but I don't think manslaughter conviction is the right way to go.
Okay, thanks. All right, with that, we now come to our favorite segment. Well, my favorite segment, the highlight or lowlight of the week, and we'll start with Damon Linker.
Okay, well, this is actually something I'm not certain the other members of the podcast even know has happened, because it's happened since we've been in the podcast pretty much. I had a few other options here, but this is now taking the cake, at least at this moment. This afternoon, which is Thursday afternoon, Special Counsel Robert Hur released his findings in its investigation of the Joe Biden handling of classified documents case, the kind of parallel one to Trump's, and pretty much exonerated him, said he didn't really do anything. That's bad, certainly would not be prosecuted, so that sounds like good news. But this is going to be a bombshell for a different reason, because of what the report states about Biden's memory. In particular, there is a paragraph in which the special counsel writes the following. In his interview with our office, Mr. Biden's memory was worse than he recounted earlier in the previous section. He did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended, and forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began. He did not remember even within several years when his son Beau died. And his memory appeared hazy when describing the Afghanistan debate that was once so important to him. Among other things, he mistakenly said he had a real difference of opinion with General Carl Eikenberry, when in fact Eikenberry was an ally with whom Biden cited approvingly in his Thanksgiving menu to a memo to President Obama. This has already, in the time that we've been in this podcast, ricocheting around Washington journalistic circles and is inspiring panic, along with statements by a lot of Democrats that this is unfair. He must have something against Biden. But the fact of the matter is that the big thing that is plaguing Biden and holding him down, I think, in his approval and in his head-to-head polling with Trump, is this concern about his fitness for office. And this is not going to help. So I'm deeply distressed about this, and I don't know what can or if anything could be done at this point, but we have a really big problem on our hands, folks, and we need to really focus on that and try to figure out what the hell we're going to do.
Wow. By the way, our producer, Jim Swift, just texted he should do the Super Bowl interview. I don't know if that's
maybe.
true or not. I mean,
should he? I don't know.
That's the thing. I mean,
if he does, and I mean, I won't even get into it. Everyone knows what's going on. But it's really worrying.
What did we do to deserve this? All right, Linda, what's yours?
Well, it's funny. Jim Swift took the words right out of my mouth, which was about the Super Bowl. This is unbelievable news, and it may accomplish which some of us believe was a good idea in the first place, which is to come up with another candidate. Democratic Party, please do it.
It's too late.
I'm not sure it's too late. They haven't had votes yet, so.
Trump v. Harris.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, dear Lord. All right. Well, do we want to go on to the highlight? Because I had a highlight.
Yes,
all right,
please.
So, and I'll tell you a funny story about my highlight, because I was all ready to have as my highlight a very erudite article, which I was going to suggest people read who weren't watching the Super Bowl, entitled Isaiah Berlin and the Tragedy of Pluralism. I read through the whole article, was about to print it out, and then realized that it was written by our very own Damon Linker. I'm still recommending it, but it is not my highlight because, I don't want him to get a swelled head. My highlight of the week is very, very different, and it has to do with the subject of race. And it was very interesting. I was doing some research in the whole DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion debate. And I don't know how I ended up here, but I ended up on a site that had a 1961 debate between Malcolm X and James Baldwin. And I listened to it. It was fantastic. James Baldwin, I'm not a big fan of James Baldwin normally, but he was terrific in this debate. And one of the things he was terrific at was talking about the something insidious that happens in the whole question of race, and when identity is all about one's race. So I recommend this to our listeners. You can read the transcript on the site I'm going to link to, but you can also listen to the debate, and I would recommend the latter.
Fantastic. I look forward to that. Bill Galston.
I'm still reeling from Damon's, highlight, low light, no light, darkness, whatever you want to call it. But I have a low light. I think that President Zelensky has made his first really big mistake since the Ukraine war began. Namely, he fired his top general, General Zaluzhny, I believe for the crime of telling the truth, and that is that the war had degenerated into a stalemate, and telling it to The Economist magazine and publishing an essay fleshing out that contention. I think that's the truth of the matter. It greatly annoyed Zelensky. And so he has replaced him now with General Syrskyi, who is despised by the troops because he's a Soviet-style general who really doesn't care that much about how many troops are killed in the name of achieving a tactical victory in one place or another. This will not play well. And I could go on at some length about the other painful truths that General Zaluzhny, transmitted to the president. For example, that they need a much bigger draft in order to be able to replace men who are exhausted because they've been fighting for 2 years without any respite. This will not end well.
Okay. Well, I do have a highlight, sort of. It's a piece in the New York Times by Pamela Paul, an op-ed writer that I admire very much. And she is willing to go where others fear to tread. And so she has written a piece called As Kids They Thought They Were Trans, They No Longer Do. It's a nice, it's a lengthy piece, and she goes in her very meticulous fashion. She's very fair to both sides, and so at one point, for example, she says, progressives often portray the heated debate over childhood transgender care as a clash between those who are trying to help growing numbers of children express what they believe their genders to be and conservative politicians who won't let kids be themselves. And then she says, but right-wing demagogues are not the only ones who have inflamed this debate. Transgender activists have pushed their own ideological extremism, especially by pressing for a treatment orthodoxy that has faced increased scrutiny in recent years. And she gives examples from Europe, where a number of European countries have scaled way back on medical interventions for kids under the age of 18, put much more emphasis on examining the comorbidities. There are many of these children who present with gender dysphoria also have other issues, abuse, ADHD, all kind, the autistic spectrum disorder issues, and so this is a plea to examine the whole child and not to allow politics to govern medical care. And it's a very, very wise and important piece that I highly recommend. All right. With that, I would like to thank our guest, Scott Lincicome, for joining us, and of course my regular panel, and our wonderful producer, Jim Swift, and our wonderful sound engineer, Jonathan Seary. And we will return next week, as every week.